I would like to call to order the Malibu City Council special meeting of May 29th, 2020. It is 3:01 p.m. May I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Mullen?
Here.
Councilmember Peak?
Here.
Councilmember Wagner? Councilmember Wagner, you are muted. You're unmuted now.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Pearson?
Here.
Mayor Fair?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. May I have a motion to approve the agenda, please?
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Do we have a roll call vote, please?
Sorry, Mayor Pro Tem Pearson?
Yes.
Councilmember Peak?
Yes.
Councilmember Mullen? Councilmember Mullen, you are muted.
For the record, he's giving the thumbs up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sorry.
And Councilmember Wagner?
Yes.
And Mayor Fair?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Could I have a report on the posting of the agenda, please?
The agenda for this meeting was properly posted on May 28th, 2020.
Thank you. Okay, do we have a staff report? Item 1A.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor and Council members, for making yourself available for this quick meeting, I hope. As you know, the state law governs evictions and foreclosures. And ordinarily, the city has no authority to regulate in that area. But in the state of, when there's a state of an emergency, the governor can waive statutes that interfere with efforts to address or mitigate the effects of an emergency or a disaster. And the governor did when it comes to the foreclosures and evictions until May 31st. The governor waived the statutes to the extent that they prevented the cities from enacting moratorium that would prevent evictions and foreclosures. And this is all justified by the stay-at-home order, right? So we are not giving any kind of rent relief. We couldn't do that. We've talked about this before when we enacted the ordinance originally, but we don't have the authority to set people's rents or to forgive rents or to monkey with the essential terms of that contract between property owner and tenant. But we, as a county and as a state and as a city, have an interest in keeping people in place during the stay-at-home orders during the period of time that we're trying to flatten the curve. So with that in mind, a lot of cities, including Malibu, enacted these temporary moratoriums. And what the moratorium does is it prevents the property owner from evicting a tenant, commercial or residential, if that tenant is not paying because they can show that the reason they're not paying is that they have an economic impact from the stay-at-home orders, right? So it's all just a bunch of dominoes that lined up. You tell people to stay home. We have an unprecedented number of unemployed people as a result. Business was upset. People who own businesses saw their profits drop. So there's this huge and immediate economic impact. And that economic impact, if allowed to go all the way down the domino chain, would lead to people being evicted from their homes. And then we'd have people out moving around. And that's exactly what, in order to address the pandemic, we needed to prevent. So we enacted this moratorium, and the moratorium has kind of two parts to it. One part is what I've just described. And then the other part of it is it allows, without penalty, a 6-month grace period to repay the back month rent once the state of emergency ends. And that, just kind of makes sense because the government's orders have caused this economic strife. And then we're trying to turn around and give people a chance to get back on their feet. It isn't a complete relief. It's just what we could do within the realm of reason. A lot of things have happened since the initial moratorium was adopted. The state has become very involved in legislation. Bills are being batted around that would deal with both the foreclosure issues as well as the eviction. And the county, the most significant thing for today's discussion is that the county actually adopted its own moratorium. And while the county's laws generally don't apply in the city because we're separate entities, exercising its emergency powers, the county adopted a moratorium that it applies to the whole county, exempting out only those incorporated areas that have their own moratorium. So that kind of gives us the choice. And the choice is to extend the city's moratorium or to allow the moratorium to sunset, and then the people would have the protection of the county's moratorium. Okay, that said, of course, as we talked about before, this is not an entirely straightforward situation. I think most of the city attorneys, and certainly I am comfortable that these moratoriums are not an impairment of contract because the basic contract terms remain in effect. The only thing gets delayed is when it gets paid, but the payment has to happen. But it is definitely, the government putting its hand in a private transaction, and that's something, that we're always, reluctant to do and careful about. The county's ordinance gives a year to pay back, but it only applies to residential, not to commercial. So there are some differences like that. It also doesn't apply to foreclosures, but as I say, I think Sacramento is looking hard at that issue as well. The county ordinance, another difference is that the county ordinance, it allows a year repayment for residential and commercial that's less than 10 employees, and 6 months if it's 10 to 100 employees. So there's, some little gradations in there. But big picture, what you have is your own ordinance, which will otherwise now expire on May 31st, or to, and then allow the county, or to extend our ordinance past the 31st. Now, the reason that it expired the 31st, and the reason why this meeting is being held so close to the 31st, is because we were acting, as I said at the beginning, on the governor's order that allowed, that had waived those statutes and had specifically allowed cities to act. And that kind of bolstered our sense of courage about legislating in this area, because we had that argument with us along with our own emergency powers. We have been working with the League of California Cities, trying to bring to the governor's attention the need to extend this beyond the 31st, but that has not yet happened. We haven't gotten a no, but there's just a lot of things going on. And so we've not successfully gotten the governor's attention on that. And so that brought us kind of to today, where we sort of need to make a decision before it expires. I'm not sure beyond that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I know we went through this ordinance already once before when you adopted it, but so what the ordinance would do if you adopt the extension is it would do two things. First, it would extend the moratorium, the part where you can't be evicted for the non-payment due to an economic impact from COVID-19, until July 30th. And it would make kind of permanent or not subject to expiration the provisions that allow for the repayment 6 months after the expiration of the emergency. I think that's all I have to say about it. Happy to answer any questions.
And what are the board shorts?
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so that second provision where you're talking about the no, does that mean that they have
forever to pay back, or there's no expiration of the thing that they have to pay back within 6 months?
They only have 6 months from the date of the termination of the local emergency, and then it's due. And the landlord has all of the remedies at their disposal. Right now, because we did it was just on the governor's authority to May 31st. So right now the whole thing is set to expire on May 31st. If you wanted to create that grace period, you'd have to take an affirmative action.
Mayor Fair, we have some speakers that we might want to hear before we hear council comments or questions.
Yes, let's do that. Okay, do we have public speakers lined up, Kelsey?
Yes, we do. We have 2 public speakers. They are Bruce Silverstein and Paul Grisanti. Bruce will be our first public speaker.
Okay, thank you.
We'd like to you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Alex, can you also share the screen so everyone can see the timer?
Okay, great. I'm going to be very short, and I apologize if this is off topic. It's pertaining to what happened on Tuesday. At this very moment, there is a bulldozer on the Smith property taking off the top surface of the land. I don't know why. I suggest that this whole thing was in bad faith by them because they clearly timed this to do it right after the meeting on Tuesday, and not understanding you would have a meeting today. But you ought to take a look at this and investigate it. It's very important. Thank you.
And the next speaker is Paul Grisanti.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I signed on simply because I wanted to hear what we're gaining by having our own ordinance. As I'm sure everybody knows, the courts are closed, so there are no there's no evictions going forward. And the other thing is, it sounds to me like the county's repayment is actually more generous than our city ordinance. And I'd love to hear more about this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Christy, can you address that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a legitimate question because there are just a lot of moving parts to this. The county's ordinance doesn't deal with commercial rents, and ours does. The county's ordinance is a little longer than ours. It is true that, it does deal with commercial. I'm sorry. It doesn't deal with foreclosures, and ours does. The county's does have a little longer. What these ordinances basically do is if you haven't paid your rent, commercial or your residential rent, because of the financial impact from COVID-19, and you can prove that, you've got medical bills, or you've got the termination notice or whatever, then it creates for you a defense in court if the landlord tries to evict you prematurely. So yes, it's true that the courts are currently not taking these claims, but they will, and soon, because like us, the courts are learning how to use Zoom. So it's not a forever thing, but that is definitely an impediment. So it's just a matter of what your defense is going to be. With our ordinance, the defense would be the local ordinance. Without it, the defense would be the county ordinance, and that's all.
So what is the repayment period in the county one?
It's a year if it's a residential or if a business from I think it's a 10 to less than 10 employees. And if it's from 10 to 100 employees, then it's 6 months. But it's generous. I mean, it is more generous than ours. Again, as anybody who's in this area knows, that falling behind on one's rent is very difficult, especially if the reason you're falling behind on your rent is because you don't have the economic resources to pay the rent. So the whole repayment ultimately is going to be cooperation between the property owner and the tenant. Anyone who is on the other side of that equation also knows that getting new tenants isn't that easy or inexpensive either. So everybody's motivated to work together. These ordinances, both of them, give the tenants some security and a defense, some time, buys them some time.
So one more question, and then I want to hear from our local merchant who has a business where he pays rent. But do we have any indication as to what the other towns around us are doing about this expiration thing? And have we been in contact with them?
Around us, I'm not sure. Reva might know, but I know the cities that I have been working in, it's a mixture. Most cities, I think, that have ordinances have been extending them. Like you may remember that when we had our very first meeting after the emergency kind of started, we were all sitting far apart from each other back in the days when we would be in the same room. You were very anxious to make sure that we did everything we could to protect people. And at the time, it felt like everything we could to protect people because this is going to go on for a few weeks. Like we had no idea at that point what the magnitude of time was going to be. And so I don't know how that weighs into your decision making, but you know that's why these things were all done in much shorter time frames.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Mikey, you have your hand up?
Thank you. With the uncertainty of where this all goes and where we end up, which obviously none of us know, is there, I get it's our choice, but is there a compelling legal reason not to just follow the county? It seems like at this point, as this moves forward, this is when a lot of different entities are going to get potentially more desperate. And do we want to put ourselves in a position where we're legally defending it, or shouldn't we? It seems like we should strongly consider letting the county or the state take that burden, because it is a complicated area of law and there's a lot of risk here and a lot of damages potentially, I would assume. So is there a compelling reason legally that you can tell me why we should do this?
Well, I don't know if I have a compelling reason, but I can explain to you what the legal differences are. I haven't heard anecdotally much use of this. I don't know how many residents or commercial tenants are not paying their rent. I just don't know. Maybe the chamber has their finger on that pulse, but I haven't heard anything. So I don't know what the impact is. But the difference is really minimal, because if somebody goes to court and says, well, my defense for not having paid the rent yet is the city ordinance, and then the court says, well, the city ordinance is not valid, then they say, well, if the city ordinance is not valid, then the county ordinance applies. And now my defense is the county ordinance. If the city ordinance wasn't there, then they would go in and they would say, my defense is the county ordinance. That's why I hadn't. So in terms of the people to whom it applies, you know, local government can either do this or they can't. There's very good arguments that they can, and we're all, you know, kind of band together, thought it through, and, you know, as a block have been doing it, including, you know, countywide, which is a pretty heavy sword. So that's kind of that part of it. In terms of the provisions, I mean, it just depends on the foreclosure part. You know, that isn't in the county ordinance. I couldn't say why that isn't in there, but it isn't. I do know that they're working on that in Sacramento, and maybe the county will eventually do that. I don't know if that's, again, a big issue in Malibu. I just don't have the facts on it.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
They're equally valid choices, if that helps. You know, there's not one that's more valid.
I guess maybe I'm wondering, by following the county, we don't need to convene as often to go over the details of something that's going to play out in a much bigger playing field than just here. So I'm at this point, I want to hear everybody, obviously, but I'm very tempted to say, let's follow the county. And I mean, it's a progressive county, you know, and the supervisors have a lot of resources to see what's going on and make decisions like this. So that's where I sit at the moment, but I'm curious to hear what everyone else has to say.
Okay, thank you, Mikey. Jefferson or Skylar, any comments, questions?
I'm good.
Okay, Rick, you have another comment, question?
Yeah, what's the deal with the state? How come they're dragging their feet? I mean, they're sort of the guys leading the charge on the whole shutdown thing. You'd think they would be looking to protect everybody. You have any insight into that? What's the deal? I mean, it's just difficult to happen up there.
The deal in terms of actually creating new policy is that it's going through the legislature now. And so it's just a lot of people, they're newly back in there, and, you know, so that'll work itself out. Why the governor hasn't extended it, it may be to put pressure on the legislature to take an action. I don't know.
If we did nothing, we just sat on our hands and didn't do anything, then do the local residents and businesses fall under the county guidelines?
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes, that's exactly right.
So that gets to kind of Mikey's point there. It's like, and to be honest with you, for a lot of this emergency procedures and shutdown and you know, stay home orders and masks ups and all that, we've essentially been following the county's directive, and maybe it would be wise to do the same thing here.
That is.
I mean, what's the downside? What's the downside if we do nothing and we just and people just fall under the county rules? What's the upside?
Well, I wouldn't say it's doing nothing. I would say you're allowing the county's protections to take effect, because, you know, when as I said before, when this first happened, we were anxious to make sure we had every protection possible. And now, as the situation is maturing, other agencies are stepping in. So we can certainly allow ours to expire, and then the county's regulations. And the only downside would be, you know, the differences. And some of them are upsides because you get more time under the county. Downside doesn't deal with foreclosures. You know, I don't know how many, realistically, how many foreclosures are at issue. I really don't know. And the courts are closed.
And we have confirmed that the county is not expiring as of the 31st.
No, it's not.
Okay. And how long do they go out? 2 more months?
Well, you know, if something happens with the county, we can always come back and provide the protection. But I mean, that would surprise me, because the county's got a lot of cities that they're protecting at this point, you know, who hadn't adopted it. But I'm trying to tell you when their moratorium part expires, June 30th, and then we'll see if they renew it. But you still get the year after the expiration to repay,
which is kind of good from the perspective of the person who's enduring the hardship. And that's kind of what I wanted to hear from Jefferson, as, you know, somebody who's there where the rubber meets the road. And if you could give the perspective of a local business owner who's been impacted, that'd be one thing.
Okay, can we just go in order though? Just Skylar's had his hand up the last couple of minutes, and then Jefferson, if you don't mind speaking after that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So I think that both, you know, I think it's important for us to also factor in there's also a hardship on the landlord as well, you know, saying that you have to, you know, forgo this rent or whatever else. So I don't want to lose sight of that, but I was going to make a motion for us to let our ordinance expire, and, you know, we'll have in place what the county has. And, you know, if we feel there's some need to extend it or change anything, then we can always do that.
Okay, let's have Jefferson make his comments or questions before we go ahead with that motion. Is that all right?
Yes.
I'll
Thank you.
second it for conversation, just for now.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Rick, for recognizing that fact. I am a small merchant tenant in a multi-tenant complex building. What we've found here is that when one tenant is having a tough time, our landlord was forgiving enough to say, send us your paperwork and show us what's going on, and we'll work it out now. But then again, I have a pleasant landlord. We have a dispensary that's doing fine. This hasn't interrupted dispensary or the pet groomer, the veterinarian. So in my little world, things are rough, but workable. But I have heard down the road at the restaurants who have long leases, 3, 5, 6 years left on the lease, that can't afford to do it, and their owners have said no pay, no stay. Those folks are the hardest impacted right now, I believe, are the restaurants. And I don't know those determinations for each restaurant, but there are 3 or 4 within proximity of me of 1,000 feet that are having a very difficult time right now. So I haven't reached out to them, but I have heard that no pay, no stay.
Okay, I'd like to comment, especially on this last comment, and particularly with the restaurants in mind. I think we would be wise to extend the moratorium for exactly that reason. And I understand for landlords the impact. They do still have the legal mechanisms available to them for reasons other than the COVID-19 impact on their tenants, residential and commercial. I've had some communication back and forth with some, basically mom and pop landlords. So personally, I'd be in favor of extending the moratorium. And I would feel like that's the best approach for us. So I know we had a motion starting. I don't know if there's, Rick, you have more comments.
Yeah, I'm just wanted you to clarify. Are you saying you want us to adopt this ordinance, or do you want us to adopt the counties where we have a 12-month payback of the rent in arrears as opposed to our 6-month thing? Is that what you,
well, sure. The first part of it, I would like to extend this moratorium.
Which I think would happen if we did nothing, because we fall into the county, which is extending the moratorium, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
The advantage of the county thing is, which I think is good, especially from the person, the government has told these businesses to shut down. So I think that the longer we give them to pay their back rent, the better, and a year seems reasonable. 6 months, I don't think it seems so reasonable, especially if we've really turned the screws to them recently. So I think there are advantages to doing the county as opposed to ours.
I think Rick's absolutely correct. I mean, the financials on paying back in 6 months are virtually impossible. Working that out on a spreadsheet, it just doesn't happen. And the other reality that's going to hit too on the commercial side is the PPP loan money. That period is coming to an end. So people's rent is being paid now. I assume they got the PPP loan. They certainly needed to have, or else they're in such trouble already. I don't even know what to do. So now is when the rubber hits the road, and negotiating with your landlord is obviously very important, because it's in everyone's interest that you don't go out of business, and everyone finds a way through it and somehow absorbs a little bit of the pain. But anyhow, I'm off topic, but yeah, there you go.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, Skylar.
Mayor, I just wanted to be clear so I made a motion that we would not be extending our ordinance. We'd be defaulting to the county's ordinance that's in place. I think that was seconded by Mikey.
Is that correct, Mikey? That was, you seconded? Okay. We have a motion and a second. All right. If there are not other comments, we should have a roll call vote, please.
Councilmember Peak,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Pearson,
Yes.
Councilmember Mullen,
Yes.
Councilmember Wagner,
Yes.
Mayor Farrer. Mayor Farrer, you're muted.
Oh, I apologize. Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay.
All right. Thank you again for making yourself available. If there's any changes on this front, I'll let you know. We're monitoring it very closely.
Okay, thank you. It is 3:30 p.m. and we are adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.